All right, what's up, people? It's Jem here.
Terence here.
We are answering questions in the Agile rooms, and this is a bit more like a, I don't know if it was a case study, but we've got the whiteboard out. It feels like a consulting call, doesn't it, really, Terence?
Yeah, a little bit. Bit of a meaty question.
Yeah, there's quite a bit to it. Let's just share with you the scenario. It's a really interesting challenge, and we'll kind of summarize this. But there's a Scrum Master, e-commerce team, highly qualified developers, back-end devs to content specialists. They've got a dedicated product owner. It's supportive. Okay, yeah, we've read this, so this is just for the benefit of the people on the call. Anyway, what's the problem? The problem is they think, the developers think it is impossible to break more significant things down into smaller pieces. So when they're coming to the end of their sprint, they may not be creating something usable or working. It's just going to be parts to the puzzle. You with me? Hey, here's a PBI for design. Here's a PBI for development. Here's one for test, and so on. Well, we don't know if there's any cards, that address some scenarios where, you get a slice of all those things. And what this coach here has tried doing was talking about talked about the use of competencies, refining PBIs, understanding the what, value, pair programming, WIP limits, and it also had one-to-ones to try and make them aware of the impact of the team. And this is really interesting. I've talked about funding. They should see themselves as a team bought and paid for one sprint at a time, and no one will pay for an analysis sprint. Whatever I've been trying to do can't change their minds. They're focused on utilizing competencies and so on. What do we do? This is a tough problem, and I think we can stop the chat now, the sharing, and we will bring it over to us. Let's start with this. Why does this even matter? Devil's advocate, so what if you can't build something usable or working? So what? Does that matter, Terence? What do you think?
Yeah, so I think from this question, I think there's three main aspects to it. One is about how do you work with UX.
Yeah.
Two was about what about architecture? Does it have to be sort of a bigger bang type of activity? And then the third one is what you've just raised. So what? Like, what does it matter if we spend a sprint doing architecture, we spend a sprint doing some development, a sprint doing tests, and so forth. So a larger sort of Scrumful type of way of working.
Yeah.
So I think they're all a little bit intertwined. I think that but so if we want to cover the so what, why does it matter whether we spend a long time building things? I think that's ultimately like asking why would you want to build something in an adaptive way versus a bit more deterministic and predictive and upfront.
Yeah. Well, I hear you, and just to kind of materialize that, if you are only building elements or components in your sprint, you are not building something usable or working, which means it's harder for you to get feedback on what you're building.
Exactly.
So that can result in building the wrong thing, because now you're waiting several months to say, yes, we've got the design part, the analysis part, the build part, the test part, and yep, here you go. So that's the first risk. Why does it matter? It matters because you could be building the wrong thing. There's risk there. The second thing, Terence, I think, we were sounding out was, you're going to end up with a big mess when it comes to integration. One of the reasons we build something usable or working is that we integrate our work as we go.
Yes.
If you integrate everything at the end, it's possible, but the amount of feedback or problems that the debris that can come out is greater, and your responsiveness to fix those things is smaller. So you've seen it in projects before. You're like, we've done it, we're ready to go. We just need to integrate.
Yeah.
For those two reasons, am I missing anything, Terence? We're talking about risk here, aren't we?
And that's exactly what you're calling out. What I was going to allude to. So the two things you called out is essentially requirements and technology.
Yeah.
So requirements are we building the right thing? Are the requirements steady? How certain are we that we're building the right thing? And technology, what's our confidence with what we're building, with what we have to integrate with? How confident are we with the APIs and other systems that we've got to work in with that we can integrate well? If the answer is that we've got a high degree of certainty of what we're building, and it's very unlikely to change, and the technology is also very stable, we worked with it before, we're confident what to do, then maybe it might be okay to be a bit more predictive. right?
Yeah.
Maybe you can have an architecture sprint. Maybe you can gold plate your work a little bit more before you put it into live. If, however, one of those things is a little bit uncertain, you're not quite sure if the technology might be changing, requirements might change, you're not 100% sure what the customer wants, then that's when you start getting into danger territory of the longer it takes to get the feedback, the higher the cost and the higher the risk that you're going to have wasted effort.
Yeah, and I think that's a reasonable balance in the conversation. So we're assuming, let's assume that you are working with a complex problem, things can change, and the risk here is building the wrong thing and an integration explosion. So we've spoken about why this matters. This is not about being academic. It's not about Scrum being right. It matters from a business point of view, and also maybe from an intrinsic motivational point of view, where if developers are only delivering elements of their work every sprint, they don't see anything usable, and then they can't understand what it is that they're building, and that maybe affects the way that they see the bigger picture, right? So there's a human cost as well, perhaps.
Yes, absolutely. I mean, I've worked with teams before where we've worked for about 8 months, we've delivered something, and then no one used the product because we found out that they didn't want to, that this was challenging transactions online and people wanted to talk to someone. You know, if you see a funny transaction on your bank account, you don't want to fill out something online. You want to talk to a human about it and give you a reassurance. And we built something that automated that online, found that no one wanted it.
Yeah.
So, and that was really demotivating to the team, as you can say, like you put your heart and soul in something, you don't want to feel like you built something that no one's using.
Yeah.
So the so what of this is that the integration, you blow up, the integration could blow up in your face, or you could deploy something that's not used as much, or not, even if you spend a lot of time in doing the architecture, you deploy it and you realize, oh, well, we need to change some aspect of this. All of a sudden, all of the architecture is no longer valid, and you've got to change it all again anyway.
Yeah.
So the risk of this is waste. Gold plating something, putting in a lot of effort around something that ultimately no one's going to use, or it's not quite right, or it doesn't integrate properly, you've got to change it all anyway. And unfortunately, I think when it comes to this, trying to get this across to the team, sometimes just trying to explain it to them, they won't see it.
No.
So sometimes if you're having a really hard time convincing the team that you want to build things in smaller chunks and to reduce the risk, sometimes you have to wait for it to happen. Wait for that integration to blow up. Wait for them to deliver something that the customer doesn't use, and we've got to change around anyway. And then we can say, look, then you can call out the cost. How can we reduce this from happening? That's when you can build the so what on the team.
Yeah, and so this is useful. And I want to step back. And for all the people watching, maybe there might be more junior people. We're saying this one piece of work, the infamous example of the tiramisu. Value means that we've got to deliver something that represents all of the increment, right? In other words, you've got the cream, the mascarpone, the ladyfingers, the chocolate, the coffee. We don't want to deliver just one element. Yeah. And so what this goes back to, the question is, we try to convince people as to work in this way, but they're not. Do you know what they're delivering? They're only delivering one element at a time. So why does this matter? We've spoken about why, and here's where we want to throw this out at you. This coach is clearly someone who's experienced. They've tried doing a lot of things, from a one-to-one basis, a team basis, the heuristics of story slicing. So what can you do? Well, I want to be a little bit bold with this. If you do not experience the consequence of working in this way where you're delivering components, then perhaps you may not feel compelled or have the driver to change. And we're making an assumption here. So when we say consequences, we're not saying to weaponize this and go after developers. We don't mean it like that. We mean, what are the business consequences? So the first thing is, have these developers ever worked in this way and seen a negative impact of this way of working? Have we built the wrong thing before? Have we had slow feedback where there's been a vast amount of rework? Yeah, so consequence one. The second one is there a product owner or a person in the business that is there creating that healthy pressure to say, look, I know you're developers and you've got the autonomy, but as a business person, it's not valuable to me to just deliver one component. And the coach has echoed this already, but is the business being direct about this? Are they demonstrating the impact of working like this? Is that known? So these are two additional things that we can consider. But Terence, can we speak to a little bit of playing devil's advocate? Is it always bad if you've got design and say UI and UX going a sprint ahead? Is that always a problem?
So that's bringing us to the second question of how do you work with UX in an agile kind of a way? And we've done this before, haven't we, Jim? We've worked with teams where we've had UX working a sprint ahead.
Yeah.
And I think there's nothing wrong with that. We've been building smaller features. We've had UX a sprint ahead, and then they'll design work on the story, then we'll work on it next, and that works fine for that team. I think the problem starts to come about where there's the two extremes. We have no UX because we're being agile, or you have UX working 6 months ahead and building a really big specification doc to hand over to the development team, or even if it's 2 months ahead, that could be 1 or 2 months ahead could be a problem.
And it also depends on what you're building, right?
Yes.
Like if you're like to your first point to start this conversation, if you're in an industry or you're building a product or some sort of service where it's not going to be evolving, where we're not really innovating, then perhaps we can afford for the design to be done, a month or so ahead.
Yes.
But I'll ask the same question. Has this team had an experience where design have moved ahead fast, and then there's been a vast amount of rework because of us not collaborating and doing things in parallel in that overlapping way? That's the first one. How about, so design aside, can you ever think of any use cases where we would be supportive of developers having an architecture sprint?
Yeah, again, I think if we're in the situation where we are really clear on the requirements we need to build, where we think they're not going to change, and we know the technology really, really well. We've also done this before, right? Where we've had a little bit of an architecture sprint, or where we've sort of gone ahead and built and just wanted to confirm the architecture because it might have been something really complicated. And maybe the sprint goal was to test out the architecture. Does it work? Does it connect? Does it give us what we want? And that has been a sprint goal before. I would say that I wouldn't want to demonize that. There's nothing wrong with that. I think the problem is, again, the extreme case. If we're doing this for everything, every time we have to deliver something, we have an architecture sprint, and then we have an analysis sprint, and then we have that's where, if it becomes, that's your normal way of delivering and you solve that for everything, that's also a little bit of a warning sign.
So, and Terence, because we're giving two voices here, aren't we? Because to argue the other way, to inject the balance back in, we're saying, has there been times whereby architecture has been done up front and it's created constraints in the system whereby you want to make changes, you want to work in a more decoupled way, whatever, a better way, but you can't do it because of the design up front?
Yeah, or we've had cases where we've had architecture sprints and then we realize very quickly after we delivered something, actually that's not quite right. That's not what the customer wanted, or that's not, and then all that work's been wasted. We spent a long time whacking together UML documents and proof of concepts, and then all of that got thrown out the window very quickly with the first release. We found out that wasn't right. So that's the dark side of the coin, right? If the requirements are not clear, or you're not quite clear in the architecture as well, or the technology that you're integrating with, you can end up with a lot of wasted effort if you're not careful.
Yeah, brilliant. So we're coming up now to like over, I think, the 10-minute mark. Then I think we can summarize. There is a theme here. There is a good reason why design could be a little bit ahead, or architecture could be a little bit ahead, but that should become not the norm. That should be the outlier. If people are working ahead, my question to the coach is this: have there been past examples of where we work this way and it's hurt us by building the wrong thing, integration issues, large amounts of rework? So there's a theme, right? Are we playing that back? Are there consequences to the business? Is that also being played back? And another angle is this: if developers are just doing their development work in one sprint and then we're doing our test work in another sprint, are we in a team which has actually got silos within it? And are there people focused on their own individual work as opposed to the bigger picture? So I don't think we've got the solution, and maybe these ideas have been thought about, but we wanted to think out loud. Terence, do you want to add anything as we wrap up?
Yeah, just to wrap, I just want to touch on one more thing because we haven't covered how do you do architecture in a sort of emergent way instead of a big design up front? So there is a technique, you might have heard of it, called the walking skeleton. And that's basically where you build something as quick and dirty as possible. It's all hard coded, it's horrible architecture, you're not happy with it, but you're able to get something out there and you're able to test things, you're able to get some sort of feedback. So you can put that out. It might be you might have a back-end architecture that's held together by crutches. They call it walking skeleton. I've heard of the term walking skeleton on crutches. They just want to give the concept of You don't want to gold place it. You don't want, you might even put it out with no unit tests on it, but you're getting something out there, just testing out the architecture, saying, does it hold together? Does it connect properly? Does it give you what you want? And then afterwards, then you can start refactoring and redesigning. And so they call it emergent architecture, because you get feedback a little bit faster, and you sort of you refine your architecture after you've confirmed that it actually is what you want and works for the customers.
Yeah.
So that's another technique. It's not always the appropriate to do that. Sometimes if you're, like I said, if your requirements are set and your technology is set and you're very confident in it, maybe you do want to gold plate from the start. But most of the time, if you're really being honest, and just because someone's got UX or designer in their name, it doesn't mean they know what the customer wants. I've had plenty of examples where they built the wrong thing and we've had to change things. So if we take that mindset of working in an emergent and adaptive way, usually we want to get things out, get that feedback as quick as possible, and then refine and gold plate it later on. So I just wanted to touch on that a little bit. How do you do architecture in a more sort of emergent kind of way?
Yeah, and thanks, Terence. This is useful. So to add, maybe it's not a knowledge problem in the team, like we're saying, because we're just going to give you an example of what the alternative is, right? If you are going to work in an adaptive way, it's a persuasion and a convincing thing for people to see the world work in a different way. And I'm gonna go back and encourage you to think about consequences. Do this to experience the impact. Are the business creating a pressure to see why it's important to work in a certain way? And we'll go full circle as we wrap this up. Often people have to feel the pain of certain things. It's got to be normalized for them to have the kind of the anchor, or that determination to make the change. So good. I'm sorry to rush things along. I think we got to 15, maybe longer. We love your feedback, Terence. Thanks for getting stuck in.
Cool.
All right. And we'll wrap it up. Cheers.
Cheers.